It is just before dawn on April 9th, 1865, and Robert E. Lee is putting on his finest uniform, a spotless gray coat, a red silk sash, a dress sword at his side. He hasn't worn anything like it in months, not out here, in the mud, at the ragged end of everything. When a startled officer asks him why, Lee answers quietly. He expects to be General Grant's prisoner by nightfall, and he intends to look the part. "There is nothing left for me to do," he says, "but to go and see General Grant, and I would rather die 1,000 deaths." A week earlier, he had still been a general with an army. Now he was a man riding toward the one thing he had spent 4 years trying to outrun. So how did the most feared soldier in America end up here, dressed for surrender, on a quiet Sunday road in Virginia? It began the way the end always seemed to, at Petersburg. For 9 months, Lee had clung to the trenches outside that city, the last shield standing in front of Richmond. In the first days of April, the line finally cracked, and Lee was forced to send the message no Confederate wanted to carry. The capital could not be saved. Get out. What followed was almost biblical. As the government fled and soldiers torched their own warehouses so the enemy couldn't have them, the flames jumped loose and ran wild. Richmond, the city Lee had bled to protect, the beating heart of the Confederate government, burned through the night. By morning, Union troops were marching into the capital of a country that was unraveling in real time. For 4 years, Richmond had been the prize the North could never quite reach. Now it was gone in a single night, and every man in Lee's column understood exactly what that meant. Lee had one move left: run. He pointed his starving army west, trying to outrun Grant, find food for men who were gnawing on raw corn meant for the horses, and slip south to join the last Confederate army still in the field. It became a foot race across the Virginia countryside, and Lee's men were losing it, 1 mile at a time. The army that had once marched faster than anyone believed possible was now a thinning column of skeletons, shedding stragglers with every step. At Amelia Courthouse, the trainload of rations Lee had been promised simply wasn't there. A full day lost hunting for food that didn't exist, a day Grant used to get ahead of him. Then, at a muddy stream called Sailor's Creek, Grant's troops caught nearly a quarter of Lee's army and tore it to pieces. Watching the survivors stagger back, Lee said it aloud. "My God, has the army dissolved?" His men would remember that day as Black Thursday. It nearly had. Grant's cavalry was racing alongside him now, slamming each escape route shut like doors down a shrinking hallway. And the hallway was almost out of doors. Grant, who could read the position better than anyone, sent Lee a note. There was no glory left to win here, only lives to waste. Surrender. Lee wasn't ready. One last time he threw his men at the Union line ahead, a final lunge to punch through and reach open road. They went forward and found the way blocked by wave after wave of fresh Union infantry, more men than Lee had left in his entire army. That was the answer. Trapped, surrounded, starving, outnumbered many times over. There was no road left. And here came the most important decision of the whole war, one that had nothing to do with tactics. One of Lee's officers begged him not to surrender at all. "Let the men scatter into the mountains," he urged, "and fight on as guerrillas, ambush, raid, vanish, and bleed the North for years until it lost the stomach for it." It might even have worked. It could have dragged the killing out for a decade and poisoned the country for generations. Lee said no. He had seen enough ruin. A guerrilla war would only pile fresh suffering on a South already in ashes, for a cause already dead, and tear wounds that might never close. He would not do that to his country. He chose instead to end it. So he put on that uniform, and on the afternoon of April 9th, Palm Sunday, he rode into the little village of Appomattox courthouse and stepped into the parlor of a private home to face Ulysses S. Grant. The house belonged to a grocer named Wilmer McLean. Years earlier, his farm had sat on the field of the war's very first battle, so he had packed up his family and moved here to this sleepy backwater to get away from the fighting. The war had followed him anyway, and now it would end in his living room. You could not have invented two men less alike. Lee, silver-haired and immaculate, dressed sword at his hip, the picture of the Southern aristocrat. Grant, splattered in mud, in a plain soldier's coat with a general's stars pinned on almost as an afterthought. Two different worlds, sitting down across a small table to end the war between them. And what Grant offered, Lee never saw coming. The terms were astonishingly gentle. No prison, no treason trials, no parading the defeated through the streets. Lee's men would give their word never to take up arms again, and then they would simply go home. Officers kept their swords, and any man who owned a horse could keep it, because, Grant said, he'd need it to put in a spring crop. Then Lee mentioned that his men hadn't eaten in days. Grant didn't hesitate. He ordered 25,000 rations sent over to feed the starving army that had been trying to kill his own that very morning. No gloating, no revenge. Lee rode back to his lines, shaken by it. 3 days later came the part he dreaded most, the formal surrender. His soldiers had to march up the road, stack their rifles, and lay down the battle flags they'd carried through 4 years of hell. But as the gray column came on, the Union officer in charge, a former college professor named Joshua Chamberlain, gave a sudden order. His men snapped to attention and brought their rifles up in salute. The Confederates, stunned, raised their own in return. No cheering, no taunts, just soldiers honoring soldiers. It was defeat, but it was defeat with honor. None of that grace was an accident. Lincoln and Grant both understood something their angrier countrymen did not. Winning the war and winning the peace were two different jobs. Crush the South into humiliation, and you'd get a sullen, rebellious region nursing its hatred for 100 years. So they chose mercy as strategy, a hand up instead of a boot on the neck, hoping to coax the broken states back into the Union rather than rule them as conquered ground. Then Lee said goodbye to his army. In a short farewell, he told his soldiers what he believed to be true, that they had fought with a courage nothing could ever take from them, and that they had been beaten by nothing but overwhelming numbers and resources. He would carry the memory of them, he said, to the end of his days. As he rode through the camp one last time, his men crowded the road, weeping, reaching out just to touch his coat or his horse, saying goodbye to the man they had followed through 4 years of triumph and slaughter. The Army of Northern Virginia was finished, and the Confederate dream went into the ground with it. Appomattox didn't end the war on paper. Other Confederate armies were still scattered across the South. But everyone understood the truth. Lee's army had been the spine of the rebellion. Once it broke, the rest was a formality. Over the following weeks, the remaining armies laid down their arms one by one. Jefferson Davis was run down and captured fleeing south. And the Confederate States of America, 4 years old, simply stopped existing. The reckoning for the South was almost too vast to take in. Whole regions lay in ruins. The economy was gone. Richmond and Atlanta were burned out shells. The 4 million enslaved people whose stolen labor had built Southern wealth were free, and with them gone, the entire order the Old South was built on collapsed. A generation of Southern men was dead or maimed, nearly every household with an empty place at the table. The South had bet everything it had on independence. It had lost everything it had. The world it had risked it all to save was gone, and it was never coming back. But the story doesn't end in those ashes, because the South was about to do something extraordinary with its defeat. That quiet afternoon at Appomattox, the dignity of the loser, the mercy of the victor, would become one of the most beloved images in all of American history. But a beaten people have to explain their defeat to themselves. And in the years that followed, the South would build that explanation into something powerful and seductive and dangerous. The myth of the lost cause. It would rewrite why the war was fought. It would polish Lee into a saint and the Confederacy into a noble tragedy. And it would fall like a long shadow across the 4 million people the war had just set free, bending how Americans remembered all of it for 100 years and more. The guns had finally gone silent. The fight over what they had meant was only beginning.